you to this panel, which will address crimes against animals, innovative outcomes for animals and people. The animal law movement has, for the most part, been really successful in showing people that animal cruelty is a problem, but the new challenge is to figure out the best path forward. So this panel is going to look to the future and explore the innovative work that's being done, including restorative justice, transformative justice, and mental health evaluations through the lens of interspecies justice and One Health. We have three wonderful experts, and after the presentations, we will be taking questions from participants joining us both in person and online. And for those of you joining us virtually, you can submit questions through the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. So now I'd like to introduce our panelists in the order in which they will present. So first we will hear from David Rosengard. He's a managing attorney at the Animal Legal Defense Fund, and in that role, he works with criminal law stakeholders to pursue justice on behalf of animal cruelty victims. David teaches animal law at his alma mater, Lewis and Clark Law School, where he graduated twice with honors as both a JD and an animal law LLM student. Prior to embarking on a legal career, David worked in higher education with a focus on sexual assault prevention and response, peer counseling, crisis management, co-curricular education, sex-blind housing programs, and restorative community justice implementation. Next, we will hear from Philip Tedeschi. Philip is the Director Emeritus and founder of the Institute for Human-Animal Connection and a clinical professor at the Graduate School of Social Work and an affiliated faculty with the University of Denver's Animal Law program. He teaches in the Human-Animal Environmental Interaction Certificate for Master of Social Work students, examining the intricate relationship between people, domestic and wild animals, and the natural world. Philip's research, scholarship, teaching, and community practice work have focused on issues of social and interspecies justice, global perspectives of human-animal interactions, conservation social work, and human ecology. And then our third presenter is Jessica Chapman. Jessica is currently a fellow with ALDF's Criminal Justice Program. She earned a BA from the University of California at Berkeley, where she double majored in Slavic languages and literature and Native American studies. She earned her JD from Michigan State University College of Law, where she received the 2020 Wanda Nash Award from the Animal Law section of the Michigan Bar. Jessica also earned an animal law LLM from Lewis and Clark Law School, and while at Lewis and Clark, she was awarded the inaugural 2021 Outstanding Animal Law LLM Graduate Award and earned placement in the Cornelius Honor Society. So without further ado, please welcome David Rosengard.
All right, so I'm delighted to get to speak with all of you today. We're going to dive in because we have a lot of exciting content to cover. This works, wonderful. So you've already heard from Pam about how at this point in the animal protection movement, we have made great strides towards convincing people that crimes against animals actually matter. To give you a quick overview of what this looks like, early on, crimes against animals, and by this I mean the whole gamut of cruelty. Neglecting animals, proactively abusing animals, animal fighting, animal sexual exploitation, the whole range was largely seen as about property. This is the, hey, you damaged my horse era, where the problem is not that something happened to the horse, but that the animal belongs to someone. That starts to change in the mid-1800s. There's a shift towards seeing animals as creatures. You can see this really remarkable language coming out of an early 1900s, late 1800s case out of Georgia. And we've really fully moved into that era now where modern animal law is very difficult, if not impossible, to explain in any terms other than being about protecting the animal as someone. You may have heard about this during one of the panels yesterday, but when we are in a scenario where it is illegal to criminally abuse an animal that you own, an animal that no one owns, an animal in private or an animal in public, it is very hard to explain that in any other way than saying it's about the fact that these animals are sentient creatures. They suffer when they're subject to this sort of cruelty, and the law exists to shield them from that. Now the question is, once we've convinced people, and I'll acknowledge we have more work to do there, but now that we've largely gotten people on board with animal cruelty matters because of animals, what do we do about it? And I'm going to suggest that there's a way forward by applying what we call an animal forward lens, an animal forward view. And I want to talk a little bit about what that means, what an animal forward approach is. This is an approach that surfaces the experiences and interests of animals and makes them something that can be interacted with, something that's legally cognizable, that is, in legal terms, jurisprudentially weighty. It makes those animals' experiences and interests something that you could factor in to a judicial decision. And it's important to realize that doesn't say the animal experience and interest is put above that of humans. It simply makes it cognizable and evident. It's about bringing it to the surface and the fore. This is not in a zero-sum binary that we're often taught is inevitable. This is not a animals instead of humans scenario or a humans instead of animals scenario. This is a animals and humans scenario. This is acknowledging that the challenge of the law is balancing a lot of different interests and interpreting a lot of different experiences. And if it was easy, we wouldn't need lawyers to do it. So yes, it is going to be hard work, but it's the work we all signed on for. So here we are. Part of that work is applying this animal forward lens and looking at these problems from the perspective of and through the experiences of the animals. So before we get into applying that specifically to issues of animal crime, I want to take a moment and talk about disambiguating some issues, because there's often a confusion of these terms when we talk about them in a criminal justice and an animal law context. And we'll start with, why are we talking about crime anyway? Let's talk about civil accountability versus criminal accountability. The legal system is very good at having ways of holding people accountable. It's part of why we have a legal system. If all we're talking about is holding people accountable for their actions, you don't need a criminal justice system to do that. You can hold people accountable for their actions by suing them in civil court. That's the genesis of tort law. One person injured another person, they're going to sue each other. It's a matter between those two parties. Or maybe it's a civilly enforceable government issue. The government is civilly enforcing against someone. It's a matter between those parties. Criminal law is different. Criminal law is saying something unique and special, which is, this is not an issue just between two parties. This issue, the harm that's been visited on the victim, is so significant that this is now an issue involving the state, the defendant, and the victim. Yes, there are three of them there. Ask me about that in Q&A if you'd like. But part of the point here is that it's an acknowledgement that what is going on is important enough to be the business of society and important enough to require intervention from society. How we intervene is different than what the criminal law is. And that gets us to disambiguating criminal law versus the criminal justice system. Criminal law is the body of law that says these actions are crimes. These actions are things we as a society have judged so significant that they can't just be resolved between private parties. It's not just, I am going to sue you, or maybe I won't, depending on what I feel. It's, this is so not okay that society needs to do something about it. The criminal justice system is how society responds. So the criminal justice system is investigation, sentencing, the goals we try to reach through those mechanisms. And often I find that people have concerns about the criminal justice system, but that bleeds over into their feelings about criminal law. And so it's important to think, when you're talking about animal cruelty and you have concerns about the outcomes of those cases, is the issue you're concerned about the fact that animal cruelty is a crime? Are you objecting to animal cruelty being something that we have decided is serious enough that it's not a matter between private parties. It's not between the owner of an animal and the abuser. It's between society, the animal, and the abuser? Or is your objection to how society handles that? Is your objection to investigation or lack thereof, sentencing or lack thereof? Because those are different questions with different solutions. Also different are the roles of vindicator and victim. And this is easy for us to mix up in our modern world. And I blame Law and Order, the TV show, not the concept. And the reason I blame Law and Order is it's running on television all the time. I'm sure somewhere right now it's in syndication. And the theme will tell you in the American justice system, the interests of the victim. Crime is dealt with by two parties, police and prosecutors. There is no pop culture discussion about how the vindicating party, the government, the party that vindicates against crime, that prosecutes cases, is not the same as the victim of crime. If you work at a DA's office, you will have had this hammered into your head. Prosecutors are not the attorneys representing crime victims. Prosecutors represent the state. Crime victims may have similar interests. They may have different interests. And when we're talking about animal cruelty through an animal forward lens, it's important for us to recognize that the victim is the animal. And the animal forward lens should tell us that we need to pay attention to the interests they have as that unique victim and recognize that the party doing the vindication, the party saying society rejects the crime, is not contiguous with that. It's also useful, particularly when we're talking about how we respond to animal cruelty, the criminal justice piece of this, to distinguish between serious and severe. Taking animal cruelty seriously starts with defining it as a crime, saying this isn't just a matter between private parties. Taking animal cruelty seriously involves responding to animal cruelty when it happens, not ignoring it. Treating animal cruelty severely is about how unpleasant that response is. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. And you'll have a chance to think about how that fits into your own approach. Finally, I'd like to distinguish maltreatment versus cruelty. This is how I will use the phrases in my presentation, just so you can follow along with my language. Maltreatment is any negative thing that happens to animals. Through that animal forward lens, maltreatment is something that the animal would rather avoid happening to them. Cruelty is when the maltreatment is criminal. So you've heard during other sessions that there's a lot of stuff that happens to animals in the world that is awful but perfectly legal. That's maltreatment. The criminal stuff is cruelty. So what is the point of all this? Well, the point is our criminal justice and criminal law has a few goals. Broad penological goals. These are the things we're trying to get done. And it's worth talking about this, not just because as lawyers we're pedantic, which I understand makes us really fun at parties, but because when we are talking about how we want the law to work, we need to start by talking about what we're trying to accomplish in the end. And these are our broad goals of any criminal system. Denunciation is a statement that the crime is unacceptable and that it is not possible for the offender to turn their victim into a means, to turn the victim into a way to achieve the offender's ends. And we can think about this in terms of financial crimes, crimes of violence, and so forth. Often an offender is treating the victim simply as a means for their own gratification. And denunciation is society standing up and saying, first, that crime is unacceptable, and second, that victim is someone. They aren't just a way for you to get money or gratify your own desires. Restoration is about returning the victim as much as possible to a place of wholeness, addressing the needs and interests of the victim. Rehabilitation is about figuring out what the risk factors were that led to the crime and addressing those internal to the offender. So I think the way we usually talk about this, you could say it's about figuring out what the underlying causes are and solving them. Deterrence is about trying to encourage people not to do the crime again. This is specific deterrence when it's deterring the individual offender. It's general deterrence when it's deterring society at large. And there's a lot of evidence that shows that the biggest deterrent effect of responding to crime is people believing that they will be discovered and they will have a relatively short order sentence. It's not how bad the sentence is, it's the certainty that you will get caught and something will happen. Incapacitation is about preventing crime by making it literally impossible for the person to do whatever the crime is. A classic example is incarcerating people, because if the crime is something that they have to be non-incarcerated to do, then that prevents them from having the opportunity to do that crime during that term. In animal contexts, possession bans are a form of incapacitation, saying you are prohibited from having custody or control of an animal because you have abused animals means that person no longer has access to victims. They are incapacitated from doing the crime. And finally, retribution. And retribution is simply, you, the offender, have hurt someone, we are going to hurt you back. In theory, that hurt is going to be proportional. It's we are going to do unpleasantness to you for its own sake. I think that is a difficulty in an animal context. Now, I will leave for you to think about on your own whether retribution is ever a useful goal of a criminal justice system. But in an animal context, you can go on social media and see people talking about how they want abusers to suffer the same fates of their animals. I'm here today to tell you that is not going to happen, and it cannot and should not happen in our system. We have constitutional prohibitions against maiming people, against torturing people. You can't put someone in a condition where they are suffering what would amount to animal neglect or animal cruelty and have that be a constitutionally compliant outcome. So I don't think retribution is on the table at all for animal cruelty. Maybe we could have an argument about the death penalty for animal cruelty. I think there are a variety of reasons why that's a bad idea. Among them, you can't unexecute someone who turns out not to be guilty. So again, I think retribution is not part of our conversation, but I do think it's important to talk about these goals from an animal forward perspective, because often when we're talking about the criminal justice system, reforming it, strengthening it, changing it in various ways, people aren't talking about it from anything other than a human perspective. So a pure retributionist or pure rehabilitationist perspective is not about animals, because someone who is focused only on retribution isn't asking what happened to the victim. They're asking, how can we crank up the unpleasantness on the offender? And someone who's focused only on rehabilitating the offender isn't asking what happened to the victim. They're not asking, what does the victim need? What does the victim want? How do you make the victim whole? They're simply asking, how do we fix the offender? Neither of these, I would argue, are helpful for animals or respectful to the experience of animals. And here, as we segue into what we do about all of this, I want to take a moment and talk about case outcomes in the status quo. So this is what you can expect to see right now in an animal cruelty case. And I'll note there is no national data on this. Anyone who claims to have national data, well, first, stop holding out on the rest of us. And second, I'd love to know where that came from. We, and by we, I mean Jessica, is working on gathering that data. Eventually, we hope to have an open source project with data from all 50 states showing charges through convictions, through sentencing, through recidivism, but we're not there yet. So this is data pieced together from what we know. We know, according to the statutes as written, the default outcome for animal cruelty convictions is going to be fines, probation, maybe a low incarceratory sentence. Some states, you're going to get a mandatory possession ban. We know in practice, once you apply a sentencing grid to that, it's going to shift even further towards probation, fines, and even further away from carceral sentences. And again, you can feel however you like about that. I just think it's important for us to know what the reality is as we talk about it. We know this is also very rarely an individuated response. It's usually just applied as a matter of formulaic rote. And we know that very few people are happy about this. I have heard members of the animal movement express various levels of displeasure with sentences being, they feel, inappropriate, too much, too little, not about the animal. I've heard prosecutors tell me, as a prosecutor, I believe in putting people in jail. That's what I do as a job. I don't believe it solves these animal cruelty crimes. I've heard defense attorneys say, my client needs these issues resolved. How do I do that? Where do I go to try to get those resources so I can go to the prosecutor and say, let's make a plea deal that gets my client some fixing? That is what we are talking about. The problem, again, is that rote outcomes aren't intentional. They don't intentionally address reducing future risk. So that's about those goals of rehabilitation, incapacitation, and deterrence. And they don't address those animal forward interests of the victim. They don't talk about restoration or denunciation. Now, you might get there as a matter of coincidence. Anything involved in the criminal justice process is not fun. As a crime victim, I go to court. Was there a few weeks ago? I'll be there in a few weeks. It's not a good time, and I'm not the person on trial. So there's always an element of unpleasantness, but these rote applications don't speak to these goals in an intentional fashion. And that's worsened by the fact that animal crimes are low granularity. So someone who neglects an animal because that person doesn't understand what the animal needs versus someone who does it because they think it's fun to listen to the animal whine and starve versus someone who's doing it because they save money not caring for their puppy mill dogs. All three of those people are getting charged with animal neglect. But I suspect that we might all agree that all three of those people could use different interventionary strategies. There's also a low lack of attention to the victim experience. And finally, there are a lot of knowledge gaps. A lot of prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges just don't know that there are more options out there other than fines, probation, low carceral sentences. Wouldn't it be great if there was an answer? And in response to hearing these concerns, people in the community, talking with my fellow panelists, we've come up with a scheme, a plan. And that plan is the Risk Remediation Resilience Program, where we apply this animal forward lens. We start from the perspective of what is the experience and the interests of the animal victims, and we focus on how do we restore those victims and prevent future victims from occurring. We do this by certifying legal, mental health, and social work professionals to apply scientific risk assessments in cruelty cases, remediate the harms to animal victims, and then build resilience against future cruelty, both for individual offenders and in communities. So figuring out what are risk factors that caused this, that contributed to this crime in the first place. What does the victim need? How do we make the victim whole? How do we prevent future victims? And how do we make a more resilient society where we're less likely to have these crimes in the first place? And my colleagues up here will be talking about the specifics of how that works, but I'll give you a sneak peek of what this program looks like. This is an online asynchronous certification program. Participants will get credits through the University of Denver. Good news, you can get CLEs as a lawyer or whatever the psych/social work equivalent of CLEs is. And the course content is going to consist of three main pieces. The first is foundational, introducing information about the law, information about animal cruelty, and about evidence-informed responses to these. The second is really focusing on those assessments, how they work, how prevention science operates. And then the third piece is really, how do you put that all together? So if you are a mental health practitioner or social worker, how do you do the assessment and translate that into some set of recommendations? If you are a prosecutor, a judge, defense attorney, a victim rights lawyer, how do you get that product from the social worker, from the mental health worker, and turn that into a sentencing recommendation, a sentencing package? I'm going to wrap up by talking about a few future implications. One is, this is self-iterative. As we open this program in the coming year, the goal is every year to gather data on how it works, what the outcomes are, pour that data back into the program to refine what we're doing, and repeat that process. So it's continually working on itself. This is a program that is largely agnostic on specific sentencing mechanisms. This is a program that, in terms of those broad penological goals, rejects retribution, but embraces the other goals of criminal law And in terms of how you get to those goals is really just asking what works and what can you do within a statute. So apologies, prison abolitionists, this is not an abolitionist podcast. Apologies, retributionists, this is not a retributionist podcast. This is a what works and what is just discussion. This is a discussion where the outcome of these assessments may be mental health treatment, possession bans, education, substance abuse counseling, anger management counseling, restitution, incarceration, or any of the many other options available. It really is about asking for this crime, what is going to be best of what we have available now. And that part is important to realize as well. It's not about what is best in perpetuity, it's what is best now, and continually looking at making it better. So as we discover better approaches, we're able to move those in to sentencing. This will change to fit the contours of animal crime. So as states pass laws to increase animal protection, this matches that. And finally, as you could probably guess from my discussions yesterday, it's really important to me that this is about looking at animals as someone, not some things. This is about saying the animal victim's perspective is critical. If we are here to talk about animal crime, we have to talk about the animal victimized by that crime, and we have to look at it from their perspective. And that's what we are aiming to do. And I will turn things over to my colleagues to talk about how that works. Thank you.
Thank you, David. It really makes me want to take this course. And
It's going to be fun.
so I'm going to bring a perspective of a social scientist, and in particular, what we refer to as social science-informed animal welfare. And I wanted to just start by backtracking a little bit and telling you just a little bit from kind of what I'll be contributing to this conversation. I started out my interest in this area in vet school, and actually it was wonderful to see Dr. Jane open the conference because she turned out to be one of my advisors on my degree program. I was in vet school at the University of Wisconsin. I realized I was more interested in people and animals and told my advisor that I wanted to leave vet school and study people and animals. He quickly told me I should not do that and couldn't do it because there wasn't really a program to do that. So this was prior to there being, programs in anthrozoology and these broader areas. That made me pissed off enough to decide to do it. And the person that was doing the work that interested me the most was at that time, keep in mind I was 21 years old, was Dr. Jane, and she was studying the interest of how animals informed us about people and believed that we could learn about one another by studying animals, by studying the broader context of the cognitive and emotional lives of animals. I went on to write her a letter. To my surprise, she wrote me back and said, not only should I do it, but I have to do it. If you know Dr. Jane, she's not short of opinions. This led to one of my bigger honors was being able to write a chapter in her 80th birthday book, actually. So I've been a fan of Dr. Jane's ever since. So this led me to the field of social work. And as a social worker, and David makes law sound particularly complicated. But if you think about animals through the lens of social work, it gets even more complicated. In fact, many of my colleagues would say, don't we have enough problems worrying about everything that people are doing, let alone starting to bring animals into the discussion? And it would kind of be nice if we could not worry about animals, frankly. But unfortunately, we do have to think about them in the context of people. So I'm going to bring you a perspective of being a clinical social worker who has studied people through the lens of the human-animal bond, through the human-animal connection. So the first thing is that at the University of Denver, there are interdisciplinary efforts underway that include the Graduate School of Professional Psychology, my program at the Graduate School of Social Work and the Animal Law program. And now we're teamed up with our fantastic partners at the Animal Legal Defense Fund and have other supporters and partners. So we've been underway for quite some time working together at thinking about these in a transdisciplinary way. One of the other things that happened when I moved from being a clinician, I was a forensic social worker for about 25 years, serving predominantly in the area of interpersonal violence, represented licensed mental health practitioners to the Colorado Sex Offender Management Board for about 10 years, and eventually migrated to becoming a full-time academic. And in the process brought with me my clinical practice, and part of that included evaluating animal abusers, doing forensic evaluations, what I referred to and what I will refer to in this presentation as forensic animal maltreatment evaluations. Now, one of the things that we have at the University of Denver that's quite unique, it might be the only program in the United States doing this, in fact, is that we have a psychology clinic training forensic psychologists and social workers how to do animal cruelty evaluations. And this is housed at a program called the Denver First program. So we now have students training under senior clinicians on how to do these particular evaluations. Now, I want to apologize for having a little bit too much text. I normally don't do this, but there are things that I would like to kind of remind myself to share with you that I do think are important concepts. And so there's a little bit of text, more text than I'd like. And I also wanted to remind, because I saw the warning, the trigger warning, that I do have one picture, I believe, of cruelty in this presentation. So if you are concerned about that, you may be forewarned. The first thing, I guess, that I wanted to try to just kind of frame is that one of the things we've learned from social work and the broader field of working with persons and risk issues is that largely we do better when we try to prevent behaviors from occurring than treating them after they've occurred. And there's an entire field of study referred to as prevention science. We also have a field called intervention science that has looked at getting out ahead of these problems, really tracing down the origins of these problems, and then ultimately intervening only when we have evidence support for strategies to do this in the most effective ways. One of those ways is referred to as One Health. So starting to think about the intersectionality. We've heard a lot about this over the last couple of days, or the, not just intersectionality, but let's say the co-referencing of challenges that affect communities, both the persons in them, the animals in them, and now we know also the environments in them, things like environmental system health. We also know that from the field of social work's contributions that strength-based approaches that largely are directed at building resilience, reducing risks, and improving protective factors are the most effective strategies at intervening in violence or maltreatment. And so that if we bring these to the field of animal cruelty, what we're going to find is that there's some familiar and common territory. Now, intervention science efforts to improve accuracy have taught us a few things, and I'll just mention kind of for reference. When we use the term risk as a term, what we're talking about are factors that are likely to increase bad outcomes, problematic outcomes. When we use the term protective factors, what we're talking about is factors that improve outcomes are likely to improve the goals that we might have. One of the things that I believe has happened, unfortunately, kind of, and this is just from my own practice as a forensic social worker, has been that the field of animal cruelty, partially shaped by the conversation on the concept of the link, has made violence towards animals kind of an exotic idea, and kind of exotified this concept as though something about harming animals is uniquely different. So I wanted to just put that out there because I think I'll come back to this in a moment, but I think what we might find is that we actually have more tools when we look at animal cruelty through these other social science informed lenses. I also wanted to just share that I think one of the things that, probably is maybe more important than anything else we might be trying to achieve is at this point recognizing that the systems to address violence in many cases are driven by the circumstances in which we find that person. Now, I'll give you more examples of that as we talk about the content of the evaluations themselves. So, I started out as a forensic evaluator being referred cases of animal cruelty. And at the time I was doing forensic evaluations on other kinds of violence, sex offending and other kinds of interpersonal violence. And what we quickly realized is that the concept of typologies, or the idea that there's an individual who abuses animals, a single type, is really not the case. And we've known that, and we've done this, by the way, in other areas as well. We, for many years, worked from the premise that sex offenders had some kind of similar typology. The reality now that as we've learned more about them is that there's multiple versions of that behavior that have to be understood to be effectively intervened upon. So in 2019, I started working in this particular area of studying intervention with animals, or with animal abusers, I would say, and developing typologies. And I looked at, for many years, the different types of behaviors. So for example, when we had newspaper articles that came out, and I had boxes and boxes of newspaper cuttings where I was trying to determine from these whether we could define typologies. I worked closely with the American Humane Association to develop typologies, and ultimately came to the conclusion that the type of behavior that somebody was engaging in maybe was, offered some information, but largely wasn't really a typology or a taxonomy, and rather told us very little about how to intervene or predict future behavior. What became more recognizable, and I've talked about this is the cover of my book called Transforming Trauma, Risk and Resilience, in our talking about our relationship with animals, is the concept of diagnostic categories, meaning that underlying most of these cases, once you start to evaluate them, we will find diagnostic relevance that is significant. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. In the book, Animal Maltreatment, in chapter 11, if you're interested, by the way, in learning more about how to do these evaluations, I have a chapter that describes in some detail how you do a forensic animal maltreatment evaluation. But suffice it to say, for the time being and for the purpose of this conversation, what I guess I've concluded is that if we're going to intervene effectively on behalf of animals, then we need to take the time to understand what the individual is actually about. Really go into these and what we would consider significant levels of individuation. And I'll just give you some examples here about, maybe just kind of a broad perspective about why we want to do this. In Colorado, we're encouraged through our statute to, in fact, we're required by our statute to engage in an evaluative process. These are considered prior to the sentencing and pre-disposition evaluations. So these are typical of domestic violence evaluations. Sex offender evaluations also take a similar construct. So the FAME includes, the forensic animal maltreatment evaluation includes many different aspects. So we're going into a lot of detail. So if you just take a look at this list, I won't read all of them, but I wanted to just maybe draw your attention to a couple of them. For example, things like academic functioning. Does academic functioning tell us anything about why somebody is engaging in animal cruelty and what we might do about it? Does the neurocognitive functioning of an individual have relevance to understanding what's happening with them? How about trauma histories? Things like somebody's early experiences in life. Well, what I found was that they, in fact, do tell us a lot, and that in most cases, not maybe every case, but almost in most cases, we can take the mystery out of why people are engaged in animal cruelty, and we can provide that information to a prosecutor and to a judge and to an interventionist in order to be much more sure-footed about accurate recommendations and intervention strategies. What we're hoping to do in our animal forward curriculum is to not only provide kind of how we go about doing this, but to encourage people to engage in this process routinely. Here's some examples. So this is the one, I think, one picture, abuse case. This is from a case that I worked on in El Paso County, Colorado. This is a German Shepherd that was hit multiple times by a claw hammer at the hands of the mother that lived in this home in front of her children. Now, most of us don't necessarily, and by the way, this woman had no criminal history, but an emerging serious psychiatric history. But if you start to look at, this is not an exclusive list or a comprehensive list, but just some of these areas. When we do these evaluations, we find causation that can range the entire multiple kind of dimensions of the mental health trajectories. Things like acute or post-traumatic or complex trauma histories, mood disorders like depression and anxiety, factitious disorders, somatic disorders, substance abuse disorders, childhood exposures to cruelty, development of early conduct problems that emerge at different stages across the human developmental spectrum. Borderline personality disorders are quite common. Interestingly enough, when I first started doing these in Colorado's statutory language, it was assumed that anger, uncontrolled anger, was the primary cause of animal cruelty, and it was written into the statute that the intervention, the clinical intervention, was going to anger group. Turns out, from my experience after having done, many evaluations on animal cruelty, uncontrolled anger is actually, it exists, and sometimes it's there, but it's actually not the primary cause of animal cruelty at all. Much more common are things like persistent homelessness, poverty issues, chronic mental health problems across the spectrum. So when we're looking at the picture of this particular animal, his experience of being abused was at the hands of his primary caretaker, a mom trying to raise her children in poverty with an emerging mental health problem. What do we want to do with her to protect this particular animal? Now, alongside this, when you're a forensic evaluator, you start to think about risk. I have been working, and I'm kind of embarrassed to say it's been taking me so long, but over a decade on an instrument called the Animal Abuse Risk Assessment Tool. We call it the ARAT, fondly. This started with Dr. Randall Lockwood's criteria that he had generated that were not necessarily research-based, but that he had found in clinical, kind of from a clinical practice standpoint, and gave me permission to begin using that as a foundation for the development of an empirically supported risk assessment instrument that we believe over time will dramatically improve our capacity for evaluating risk. And when we're talking about that, what we really mean largely is our ability to utilize the concept of risk in a constructive way. So I wanted to talk, I'm sorry about the small font here, but let me just pull out the salient points. Thank you. Yeah, I'm almost there. So I just wanted to mention that when we talk about risk, we need to probably recognize that risk is not always correlated with criminogenic factors, meaning that when we say high risk, we don't always mean highly dangerous, right? And this is where I think we have to be careful about the concept of the conflating the link with things like, mass murder or school shootings or these highly dangerous individuals that we get oriented towards. We could have somebody who's very high risk to animals and not high risk to persons. We could have persons who are high risk to animals and are not criminal at all. So for example, our collectors or hoarders would fall into those sorts of categories. So most importantly, trying to begin to recognize that when we're talking about risk, we want to use that information to intervene accurately and most effectively. And that largely we should be using this instrument as an assessment tool to improve outcomes. We've gained most of this information from our own research, so we've tried to gather as much case information as possible. Most of that is from in Colorado. We've used information coming from the animal protection officers, professional stressors studies that we're doing at the Institute for Human-Animal Connection, and then other sources as well. So lastly, I'll just mention as social workers, I believe that one of the elements that we should be bringing into our conversations, and the reason I, by the way, have a picture of this orphaned elephant at the David Sheldrick Trust in Nairobi, is that these are elephants that about half of them die as a feature of their grief. They're being heartbroken as to what has happened to them, the loss of their families. And as David so accurately talked about, putting animals forward would mean being aware that animals are highly sentient, that we will need to recognize that in the context of our work, that we should never minimize animal cruelty, but we should also simultaneously not fail to appreciate that we're talking about interspecies justice issues where criminal justice matters often intersect with social justice issues, including all of the intersectional issues of oppression that exist in our society today. So I won't go through the questions because I know you're going to facilitate those. Thank you very much for your time, and thanks for having me.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and having us. First, I would also, on behalf of our team, like to recognize a land acknowledgement for the fact that these lands have been colonized, forcefully so, and the forced removal and also attempted or successfully, sadly educated, genocide of the indigenous lands that were here before us. And also we can talk about this in more detail, but we'd love to thank the foundations that sponsored our 3R event, our 3R program. So my project in this presentation will key off of what David and Phil discussed. And the animal law movement has really developed organically as much as the criminal justice system has. We've tried to live with animals and with human nature and the limited resources and insecurities that arise or just challenges. We've committed atrocities against animals and other humans. And so the criminal justice system comes in part as a reaction of how to manage those different atrocities while also moving forward. So in that, we are looking at trying to create a new system in which we address animal cruelty and maltreatment, as David and Phil mentioned, but in a way that looks at the whole perspective and doesn't necessarily use a system that clearly doesn't work. And so with that, this presentation will be talking about those One Health perspectives that Phil had mentioned, as well as the incorporation of restorative justice theories and transformative justice theories, and then ways that we can actually use therapy that is customized and works for individuals who've committed cruelty, so that we do nip it in the bud and we do address the underlying causes that arise and inspire cruelty rather than putting a Band-Aid on it, and how all of these approaches will apply to the 3R program and also hopefully help to revolutionize the legal system in a way that is not adversarial, but brings everyone together as a team. And that includes all parties, so the victims, the communities, and the individuals who've committed the offenses. So I won't go over this in too much detail since Phil did a great job, but when we're looking at different ways to create a new system in addressing animal cruelty, we want to look at the fact that it really does consider in the entire environment that the animal cruelty exists in. So that includes the people that have been affected either directly or indirectly by the cruelty, the animals themselves, including the animals and the way that they return to their cultures of their own species. And then also the environment that we may not consider active participants. So that is the air and the water and the land, the buildings that we're in. And then how does all of this affect our emotional, physical, and psychological harms that are caused because of animal cruelty, and how that affects the entire ecosystem of all beings that belong within it. We can't do this though without realizing that this approach has to include all beings and all people of all backgrounds. And so AFCO and SILCO have been referenced in these conversations the last couple of days. And I think actually the previous presentation really teased our presentation up very well. But we need to look at how other social justice perspectives come into play and how they need to influence our approach to animal cruelty, as well as the way that our reaction and perspective and hopefully proactive approaches to working with animal cruelty can positively impact other social justice movements. The other part too is that though animal cruelty is essentially a human problem because humans are the ones who are committing it, interspecies justice is vital because just as the One Health point comes in, we're all connected. And so though cruelty may be happening to a dog, you don't know how that could be happening to a horse or to a whale. And so really looking at the macroscopic view of the way that cruelty may create an impact. And you could see that through looking at potentially what is cruelty, even when it's legalized. Is that slaughter in a slaughterhouse? Is that hunting? Is that a rodeo? Is that a science experiment? Is it domestic violence? And so really seeing how our perspective towards what cruelty or maltreatment are and whether it's socially condoned or not, and how we can move forward and to make a much more peaceful existence for everyone is critically important. So I won't go into as much detail about retributive justice because David did a great job on that. But I do want to look at restorative justice and transformative justice. And restorative justice comes from a way of resolving conflicts within communities from indigenous nations on these lands that we call the Americas, Canada, Africa, New Zealand. And it's a way of focusing on the victims and the communities and bringing them into a place of being whole again after the harm has been committed. Brittany Hill, who was the fellow with the criminal justice program before, there wrote an excellent article about bringing restorative justice to the animal movement. And so I welcome you to read that. It's fascinating. But it really does look at trying to bring the entire community together and allow the person who has committed the offense to restore themselves as well and make peace with the harms that they've caused and recognize the harms that have impacted the community that was around the cruelty. Transformative justice is another step, and it's a little bit different because it's actually a critical approach to looking at the fact that not only is the system that we exist in currently oppressive, but it's actually unjust. And by creating this continual adversarial discussion about what would be labeled an offender versus a victim and having them on two opposite sides doesn't allow us to move forward and say, what are the true issues happening? How are animal cruelty issues things that are coming, but are also a symptom of a larger problem? Be that because an individual is experiencing poverty or social injustices that we haven't looked at, which is Phil's assessments do a great job of really trying to parse out. So in all of this, and this is what the 3R program really works to do, is we're trying to establish a new approach, something that works outside of the system that we currently have, which, as I mentioned earlier, kind of developed organically and from a Roman law, which is not the culture that we live in today, because our culture has evolved as well. So we're trying to move beyond retributive justice. There are some academics and theorists who think that it's appropriate, and I appreciate their arguments. I think for animal cruelty, though, looking at One Health, looking at a way to end harm and arguably harming an offender or a person who's committed cruelty just because they've already made an act, and doing this eye for an eye exchange doesn't help us move forward and try to end animal cruelty at all. It really just perpetuates a problem and creates more negative energy and anger. Then there's also restorative justice, and New Zealand has a wonderful model. So they've worked with the Maori and have worked to incorporate restorative justice practices into the legal system. And so they're using the current system and then bringing in traditional cultures ideas and using that through having restorative justice meetings and talking circles and different methods that come about, and then using those interactions as ways to incorporate into sentencing or seeing what might be a vital option for the people who've committed the offenses, as well as the victims and the communities. And I welcome you to look at that as well in a little bit more detail. Transformative justice, which I think is what we're all really trying to go for, is a way to heal and grow and change as a culture, as a legal system that hopefully can bring everybody on board: prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, social work professionals, mental health work professionals, and find a way to not only identify that animal cruelty is an underlying problem for the individuals who've committed it, but it also tends to other factors, and find a way to have people in a mental state where they no longer feel the need to manifest their symptoms of perhaps trauma or other underlying causes like mental health, so that they're not inspired to commit cruelty in the future. And so that's where looking at different rehabilitation and trauma-informed therapy, I think, is key. With this, and I'll get into it in the next slide or so, we are absolutely working to heal and restore victims and communities, and making sure that they are prioritized and ensuring that animals are the focus of our work. But we're also looking to try and heal the people who've committed cruelty, because unless they're healed, animal cruelty is going to continue. And our systems that we use that exploit animals and hurt them in socially condoned ways will also continue. So, as Phil had mentioned, there are quite a few different forms of science that come into play. And I think this is key, because law by itself isn't effective, and science by itself isn't always effective either. We need these two different groups of individuals to work together to prove what actually works and is successful, and then integrate it into our legal systems. And so that's where studies that come from intervention science and trauma-informed responses and rehabilitation and therapy and studies that have gone into that are a key point into getting into the idea of prevention science, where we can identify perhaps what may be called red flags or risk scenarios, where we can help people that might have a propensity to commit animal cruelty or human cruelty, and help heal them before it ever happens. So with all of this approach, though, of course, people who've committed cruelty are still held accountable, but we recognize that they are individuals that are deeper than the crimes that they've committed. And so we're working to get them into a place where they do feel stable and healthy enough to recognize what they've done and to interact with the victims and communities that they've harmed. We're working at bringing everyone back into a healthy manner. And that comes back to that One Health perspective, where if one factor of your ecosystem is unhealthy, the entire ecosystem will fail eventually. And so we're looking at finding those little key factors that may be part of the underlying cause to ensure that we don't have to have a reactionary method to ensure that we're healing a healthy ecosystem, but and not putting band-aids on, but looking at what may not be right on the exact instance that we identify an issue. And so that way we continue to uplift an ecosystem without something going wrong. And this way, we also work to not have harm occur in the future. I apologize, there are also a lot of words on this slide. It's more for a reference point, and I don't need to go into detail on some of them because Phil and David have done such an excellent job. But I would like to mention one approach that I think could work for people who have experienced traumatic events, and that might have led to their commission of animal cruelty. And I want to also thank Lewis and Clark and the Center for Animal Law Studies for allowing me to really interrogate this idea during my animal law LLM, because without that time, I wouldn't have been able to come to this conclusion or meet this amazing team. So my perspective and my proposal is that, as Phil had mentioned, animal cruelty doesn't necessarily happen in a vacuum. Somebody doesn't wake up one morning and say, this is going to happen, this is the path for me. There are a lot of things that lead to a person's commission of animal cruelty. And I argue that those things often come from traumatic events. And though this may not apply to every individual, I would say that a lot of people commit cruelty because they've experienced trauma in their lives, whether it's direct abuse that they've experienced or that they've observed, socially condoned violence towards humans or animals, and that these feelings that they may not be able to recognize as trauma or diagnose as such, and they may not have the resources to have work with a therapist to diagnose, become undiagnosed manifested symptoms. And when that happens, people feel out of control. As well, trauma's symptoms will evolve into mental health illnesses, including PTSD, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, really terrible, frustrating mental health illnesses that oftentimes may not have existed prior to traumatic events or were exacerbated by traumatic events. And so if there's a way recognizing that these mental health issues come or these undiagnosed, terribly manifested symptoms arise, what can we do about it? Well, there are a lot of individuals who've experienced crime and sexual assault. And there are some amazing programs out there that work to use therapies, trauma-informed therapies, to help those victims heal from the traumatic events that they have occurred. These, though, are applied to people that have just experienced the victimization. What I argue is perhaps one of the approach to looking at ways to change the system and to make it novel and new and really approach a One Health perspective is by saying, perhaps the individuals that have committed cruelty were also victims at one point, maybe not from a specific person, or maybe they were, but by a traumatic event. And so these individuals were just victims that didn't get the help that they needed at the appropriate time. And then that's where the symptoms started manifesting and becoming unmanageable. And that's when they started looking at ways to develop an ability to regain power and control of themselves by committing cruelty towards vulnerable beings that were in a place that they couldn't protect themselves. So there are quite a few different therapies that are trauma informed as well as PTSD specific. And I use PTSD because I think a lot of people may have an inkling of it or have experienced it or have people that are in their family or community members that whether they've have recognizable PTSD or undiagnosed PTSD, but it is a very intense mental health illness that comes from trauma. So we use cognitive processing therapy, which is much more an intellectual interrogation into why the acts or the feelings that have arisen in a person occur, and allow the person to really understand their mind and how they went from a point of not having PTSD to going to a point where they have an event and they do feel like they have a loss of control. And eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy is an approach that is at a much more physical level. So if you aren't in a position to necessarily speak about why you think the PTSD happened or the trauma happened that caused the events that you did, the actions to occur, it allows you to still have the physical benefits of healing from the trauma. And we could use these on people who've committed cruelty or who've committed offenses towards other humans. And by doing that and looking at them as not to label victims, but victims in this sense, we help heal them of their trauma, and we help heal them of their mental health illnesses. Because remember, not everyone who has a mental health illness is violent, and then resolve the issues, the underlying causes that have led them to commit those cruelty pieces of violence. And then we also stop them from victimizing themselves every time they commit cruelty, but in turn, we also prevent them from committing cruelty and victimizing other beings in this world. And so really, it is an approach to nipping the issue in the bud. There are also a couple other approaches, and I know we're running out of time, so I'd be happy to talk about this more offline, and also an article that I wrote about this topic that, again, thanks to Lewis and Clark and ALDF, I was able to finish and have published in the Manitoba Law Journal next year, is looking at ways to continue to support individuals that have gone through therapy or rehabilitation after either they've left the incarceration experience or going through sentencing, or hopefully we've caught them before they've even had to enter the legal system. And by giving them a support network where they can be with like-minded individuals who've had similar histories, and they can support each other through the process of having had rehabilitation and therapy and healing with each other and being with people that understand each other and are able to work into their community again, and deal with the triggers that might have caused cruelty or them to commit cruelty in the previous experience. Then after therapy, they know that they can happily and healthily heal and work through those triggers without being activated. Almost like an Alcoholics Anonymous, but I don't want to label them. I think they're very different and unique situations, but that's kind of a community experience where people can come together in a safe space and work through what's going on in their head or their life to be able to support them from not committing cruelty or violence or other crimes as a way to manage the problems that were happening for them or the emotions that they were feeling in the past. This is a really long-term, stable approach that obviously need to have counties be willing to participate with us and look at using this in the carceral systems and the court system. So it's a long game here, but these are the initial steps for having these conversations. Another way of looking at approaching cruelty towards animals and humans and perhaps recreating a system is finding ways to get the ARAT or the FAME to occur prior to the legal system even really coming into play that leads to a conviction. And so one of the conversations that our team has actually had recently is about talking about when would be the appropriate time to have an assessment for an individual who's committed cruelty. Could it be before trial, after they've received the charges, but before they even go to trial and then lead to that very traumatic experience of being in court? Could that identify different issues or factors that have led to what could be considered cruelty legislatively, but are actually poverty issues or economic issues or just lack of resources to vets? Are these things that we could actually create in a way that's non-adversarial, in a way that the legal system and mental health professionals can come together and say, this individual unique experience and cruelty has occurred in this one vacuum, if you will, but it's clearly not a vacuum. And how can we work together to prevent this person from being in this situation again, rather than charging them with something and then exacerbating the pre-existing issues that led to that cruelty and likely giving them more reason to be frustrated or angry or worsening their circumstances that may have been out of their control after pushing them through the legal system. Obviously, there are cautionary concerns to a practice like this, but these are the types of discussions that we're really trying to have in a way to revolutionize the system and make one that doesn't have that dichotomy between us and them or good and bad, but really looking at people as individuals and beings as individuals that are part of an entire ecosystem that needs healing. And so the way that all of this applies is through to the 3R program. As David had mentioned, we are creating that foundational knowledge for social health professionals, mental health professionals, and of course, legal professionals. And then giving them the experience and case experience of the risk assessments and Phil's work that he had mentioned, and then trying to propose new solutions like the one that I had mentioned, and really encouraging students to think of new solutions as well that they can bring back to their counties and their court systems, and perhaps, you know, their agencies that they work for, so that they don't continue putting a Band-Aid on the cruelty that's occurring, but really are able to make a foundational change within their environment, their community, their agencies, their counties, but one that's also specific to their county, because every county and state community is different. And so this is, again, a continued interrogation, as David had mentioned, and something that once these courses are finished and all the lectures are recorded, they'll be updated, and we'll be continuing to have these conversations with people that come into the program and leave, and our alumni, and just brought more and more into a group of like-minded individuals and also diverse-minded individuals. So that way we have more people at the table to discuss these different options and to really work at curbing animal cruelty rather than having it as a perpetuation, and hopefully seeing less violence throughout the world. So I welcome questions. I know that there's a lot to talk about, but I'm really excited for the work that we're doing. And I'm so excited to have a conversation with everybody, what your unique perspectives are, how this might be a problematic approach because of your background, or how it might work. And also what new innovative ideas you can think of that we would love to listen to and hear about, so that way we can make our program better and really make this entire existence of animal cruelty and the relationship between humans and all beings better. So thank you so much.
That's a lot. There's a lot lot of amazing work that's been going on and that is going on. So thank you so much for all you're doing. And those were absolutely wonderful. We only have a couple of minutes. And so please, if you do have questions, please line up at the microphones, and I will ask, because we have such limited time, keep it really short. I know that you all have a lot of knowledge and context.
You can talk to us after.
Yeah, you will have all the time in the world afterwards to talk to the speakers, but let's go.
Oh yeah, you haven't seen great years, so I'll keep it quick. The first of all is Rebecca Ledger. I'm an animal welfare scientist. I heard a lot about the animal experience, but nothing about scientific validated frameworks for evaluating the nature and the severity of the animal suffering. From somebody who does a lot of cruelty cases, the vast majority of cases I see, and I'm not an expert in evaluating the abusers, but most of the people I see committing these crimes are uneducated. It's not that they didn't love their mother or whatever. It's just because they didn't know better, because the dog trainer told them to asphyxiate the dog on the end of a choke chain, because when the cat peed in their bed, they thought punishment was the best way to deal with it. That's why they strangled the cat. So I see that there's a place with this very sympathetic, in my opinion, perspective or approach to dealing with many animal abusers. But what is your thought on those others, the ones that honestly are the majority of my caseload? The people who just, I don't think they need to sit down and a cup of tea and therapy themselves. They need education, right? Thank you.
Well, again, the premise of the program is to suss out what the factors that made that particular cruelty likely are. And the answer may be, as you indicated, ignorance about the needs and experience of animals. The answer may be, this person knew that they were being awful to animals, but it made them money. The answer may be, this person has an actual diagnosable mental health issue, although we know that mental health is usually associated with being victimized rather than victimizer. It could be a variety of things. From there, you connect it to the appropriate outcome. So if you have someone who needs education, that's great. That should be built into the sentence. But it's important to realize that that risk factor is a reason. It is not an excuse. So in addition to addressing the reason through the sentence also needs to address the impact on the victim. So you're addressing the behavioral needs of the animal, the fact that the animal suffered, work the animal may need to do to recover from both physical and mental injuries that the animal has been through. I think it's difficult to talk about in general because we're envisioning a system that applies to all animal cruelty offenses, but it really is about what happened, why it happened, what the victim needs, and how do we resolve keeping this from happening again.
And humane education may very well be one of those options, but we go through that process to determine what it could be and what would be a rehabilitative method to help with that.
Yeah, I think I would also just add, that's true in other kinds of interpersonal issues, let's say child maltreatment, where somebody doesn't know how to parent a child, for example, has similar challenges. In the evaluation itself, it often falls under the category of what we consider culpability. And we've also been encouraged to think of it as blameworthiness, right? Would you hold somebody accountable for something they don't know better for? Now, we may say, no, we shouldn't really hold them accountable for that, but we should change that risk factor, right? We would want to, for example, if they're lacking that information and that's the primary driver of the risk, then we need to change that factor. But we may want to see it as them being having fairly low culpability relative to the behavior they engaged in, because they may not have, if they really didn't know better.
And if you were enrolled in the 3R course, we'd have an entire session on the difference between social work culpability and legal culpability, because we just use the same word to mean two things.
Yeah.
So if you're a lawyer out there and you're like, wait, no, that's not how it works.
Yeah.
That's okay. There's a reason.
And yeah, that's why we've been encouraged to call it blameworthiness, so we can agree on that.
All right, one last question right here.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify, am I clear to understand that the 3R program applies to cruelty cases to deal with companion animals and not wildlife cases?
Any cruelty case at all. And so I argued that the unlawful killing of wildlife is almost always cruelty. Typically, when an animal is killed illegally, a wild animal is killed illegally, that is often charged as poaching, which is a crime against the state. You're stealing the government's animal. But usually, the only reason you can hunt animals and not have it be cruelty is because the law says, if you are lawfully hunting, we as a society are willing to sign off on the suffering you cause the animal. So if you're doing it illegally, you don't get the excuse. It's cruelty, and you'd be back in this analysis. So for a case of someone hunting unlawfully, I imagine risk factors might be economic factors, cultural factors. We've seen cases here in the Northwest, people who hunted animals illegally because they enjoyed the bloodshed, they enjoyed the death, they enjoyed watching the animals suffer, and they indeed subject the bears and others that they would hunt to inordinately egregious treatment. Those offenders would all have different treatment strategies, response strategies, sentencing-wise. Also, the animals are going to have different needs, sentencing-wise, but those are all crimes. Again, it's a reason, it's not an excuse. Cool story, still a crime.
Yeah, I mean, probably, I would say one of the limiting factors, limiting challenges for this program, but it faces the entire animal law field, would be those areas that have socially condoned forms of violence towards animals. I mean, if we, there's going to be the challenge, for example, of how do we talk about farmed animals, that are invisibilized by our society. And we largely don't see that as illegal or criminalized. That complicates treatment of somebody who's abusing their dog, right? If they're simultaneously living in a society that invisibilizes all those other individuals. But that is the nature of our society. We do that to people regarding people as well, where we right here in Portland, recently, there's been a movement to criminalize homelessness, for example. And that complicates our strategies for intervening effectively in all aspects of the human condition as well. So I think we have plenty of conundrums ahead of us. And I think you're bringing up, kind of at least speaking, or at least suggesting that we probably have those ahead of us. And I think we would agree.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us. Thank you to the presenters once again. This was wonderful.
Can I say one last
Oh, of
thing?
course.
It's worth noting that a lot of this work is not intuitive, and it requires people willing to go out on a limb and put support behind doing this kind of work. And I'm really profoundly grateful to the Kirkpatrick Foundation and the Mead Foundation, in memory of Jane Mead, have made some really helpful grants to support this effort. So yeah, thank you to them, and thank you to all of you for being here and being willing to talk about this. We really appreciate it.
Please come and join us on the
Yes, please come and connect with them afterwards. Thank you.